The dashboard I found very handy. The big one I've found is that there's an easy way of sort of seeing what development projects are on the horizon, which I think is super important for buying into an area, because if you've got lots of infrastructure going into to an area, like for example, I think Townsville on the horizon has got major dam construction, some rail, some defence infrastructure, some defence migration moving from Adelaide into Townsville, which will add more people looking for places which boost rent. You've got solar, wind farms, and then that's not even without sort of getting into your nickel mine territory and that sort of stuff, which also is pretty significant for that area.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Dashdot Insider, the auditory epicenter for passionate property investors seeking a life of freedom, choice and abundance. Joining me today, we have another very special guest, one of our special clients that we have here at Dashdot, Tony Wilkinson. And Tony has one of the more interesting property journeys of all of the people who have spoken to him. And I know everyone's journey is interesting in its own way. Tony's, I think, serves as a little bit of a lesson, a little bit of a case study in somebody who was very much into property and then for various reasons spent a little bit of time out of the property market and has now jumped back in. So to start off with, well, first up, Tony, how are you feeling today?
But really good. It is quite an interesting story. Having lived it personally and over a number of years, it is pretty fascinating. It's always interesting to tell people that you might have dinner with and associate with. And most of my good friends know the story only too well. But it's quite the journey, that's for sure. But it ended up in a good spot.
Let's start at where you are at the moment. How many properties do you have?
Two. So I've got one in WA and one recently purchased in Townsville in Queensland.
Okay, well, the WA one, I've got some numbers here, and the numbers on the face of it are looking fairly amazing. The purchase price was $420,000. Now, the total growth since that purchase has been $174,000. So that's a 41.43% increase over the course of, well, that's actually a May valuation. We ended up doing a lot of vals for clients in May. So a couple of months away, I would be surprised if you're not somewhere north of 600K. So you may well be pushing 200K in equity that you've built in that time, which is pretty decent.
It's pretty phenomenal, absolutely. Yeah, it's that particular pocket, I think, has been one of the best performing to the top five sort of areas of Australia in the last 2 years. So, super happy with it for sure. I had a quick look a couple of days ago and probably think it's sort of in the range of sort of 615, 620 at the moment with a couple of recent sales.
So up at 620, if that's 620, that's going to be pretty much bang on 200K in equity, which is going to be very close. That's going to be about, 47% total growth since the purchase. Now, the purchase about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other really good piece about that is that I haven't really had to put a lot into the property at all. It's sort of been positively geared. Good tenants, been in there the whole time. Good yield, and didn't have to do anything really with it, and haven't had to do too much. I had to put some new fly screen doors on. That's about the only thing really I've had to do. So it's been low maintenance and really high growth and sort of good fundamentals for sure.
So it's a good sort of a set and forget property, and you just settled on one up in Queensland, which is obviously pretty good as well. Let's rewind the clock a little bit then. You've had quite an interesting sort of journey, as I mentioned. You're sort of starting again back into the property market after the age of 40. Right? A lot of people listening might be over the age of 40. A lot of people think, by the time you hit 40, you need to have made it. If you're not there by then, things get really tough. But I think you might be a bit of an example of actually, no, you can absolutely still nail it after 40. But it didn't start there. It started quite a while ago. Do you want to take us back to how your property journey started?
Yeah, like a lot of people, I was a pretty excited 20-something, university educated and wanted to get ahead really, really quickly in life, sort of financially, and got into my first property, 50% share with my mother, sort of a two-bedroom unit. in Cogra, which we lived in, had for about sort of 3 odd years. And yeah, basically worked 2 jobs to get a little bit of a deposit that I didn't have. Mum put in most of it, but I had a good income with the two jobs I had at the time. But I was working hard. We also then bought another property, a little sort of 4-bedroom house in Tamworth, in a sort of a 4-bedroom house in Tamworth. Would you believe we only paid $40,000 for it at auction, and it rented for about $150 a week. So certainly evidence of a positively geared property. And you'll be
good yield.
Exactly.
Good yield on that.
You'd be interested to know I organised 8 friends and a couple of family to go up and renovate the entire place in 2 days. Well, for actually Friday, Saturday and Sunday. We painted inside, outside. I had a handyman come around and do everything, and sort of carpet went in on the Tuesday and rented it the following week. And it was coincided with the first season of the block, would you believe? So everyone was wanting to renovate, and this is how you do it. And all the rest of it.
Very good.
So about the most expensive part of it was getting a speeding fine on the way up. But it was
that's a classic. That's a classic Aussie story, isn't it? Right? These days, you want to do a renovation, you have to buy the course, you have to organise. Oh, what's the budget? You've got to do all of that. It's not like sort of 20 odd years ago where it's like, well, let's get a bunch of mates and let's just nail this thing over the weekend, right? It's very wholesome.
We still talk about it, actually. I was still probably over a couple of people painting their houses, actually. But I think it taught all of us, everyone on that trip has subsequently got, multiple houses, and one does a bit of property development. So I think it taught a lot of us, a lot of really good fundamentals around a property. I then basically sold both of those. Mum kept the place in Tamworth as an investment, but I wanted to buy a longer-term investment in Tamarama, and I pretty much had to have those two to have enough of the deposit to buy a 1-bedroom unit in Tamarama. So, got into to that. I think the learning experience out of that, whilst all of those are actually phenomenal investments if you look back at what they're worth now and that type of thing, particularly sort of Tamarama, I did find at the time that it really pushed me income-wise. It was pretty badly negatively geared at the time. Interest rates were a little bit up, probably in the 6s, not too dissimilar to what we are now. And I really didn't have a lot of income left over, and I had to wait until sort of tax time to get the benefits of that. And I think probably the learning is that one bit it probably didn't appreciate as much as houses ultimately do. And I look back on that investment. I probably had it for 6 years, and it probably put less than what the place in Australian or Bunbury has put on in the last couple of years. So even though it's a really good part of town in Sydney, all of those type of things, it did teach me a lot of lessons, those 3 in combination.
It can be a little bit tough, and I think it really comes down to personal preference, because it's sort of the big question is how much can you suffer now for the long-term goal? And some people, they are really prepared to suffer. They will budget, they will scrimp, and they will save every penny that they can. They'll work 2 jobs, as you did a long time ago. They will suffer for a future that they really believe in. And with that comes stress, right? So it's not just the suffering of I'm going without, but it's the stress of I've got to pay this mortgage this month, I've got to pay this debt on this, I've got to pay this debt on this. But if you've bought the right properties, time means that it can be a very, very wise decision for some people. What it does to you and how it makes you feel while you're going through that process can be very tough. And, some people stress can be a real killer, right? For some people, it can be too much. Their personalities can be affected or they're stressed, they're always strung out, that sort of thing. Some people seem to be able to deal with that a lot better. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people that are just like, I just don't want any stress in my life. I don't want to suffer like that. I'm just going to go at my own pace. I'm going to buy a property. The wealth will accumulate. It might take me 15 years, but I'm comfortable and I don't have to stress about it. It might take me 20 years. And so we talk a lot about, at Dashdot, we talk a lot about making sure that your goals or your strategies aligned with your goals. And there can be a massive difference in what the goals are for people, but also the strategy to get there, depending on how much people want to suffer. And I think it's easy just to go, I'll take all of that on because I can see this here, this big portfolio that everything snowballs into eventually. But man, it can be tough. And so I think it's important to be cognizant of that and think about it, properly before you sort of rush in. So what was the emotional experience for you like when you've got this property that's a bit negatively geared?
Yeah, we had to think about a lot of things, on a monthly basis, and I think probably it segues into probably the mistake I made. Even though property's been a very, very good journey for me, I was had shares at the time. They had managed investments at the time, and then subsequently chose to sort of gear those investments through sort of margin loans and loans off investment banks, etc. So I could sort of supercharge both the property, which I thought was going in the right direction, and also shares, which before 2007 were also in a very, very good space as well. So I had, both of them going very, very well. And what I found, because I had things like margin loans and investment loans against shares, I wasn't prepared for the GFC when sort of, markets went back, depending on who you talk to, anywhere between 30 and sort of 50%. I think All Lords was sort of 6.2, got back as far as 3.3 just off the top of my head. I was a bit lucky, actually, because I had a margin loan, I had to sell out on the way down and probably sold in the fives, but still lost most of the money that I actually made, in the previous sort of 4 or 5 years, and probably at the time thought, I could probably hang on to this property, but it's really going to put a lot of pressure on, because GFC, I was also in a sales role, so things weren't absolutely flying along either at work at the time. So I had to sort of, had the double whammy, right? So long story short, I sold out of Tamarama, and I said, you know what, because of the sort of share market correction, pretty much what I made in 6 years, doing a lot of work and probably been a pretty advanced sort of 20-something, early 30-something in life, that, probably didn't have a lot. So, but I did have a very, very good job, still have a very, very good job, and thought, you know what, because I was working 2 jobs in my 20s, I probably didn't, and I was so obsessed about saving, I probably didn't have too much of a life. So what I did was took 10 overseas trips for the next 10 years, and I've been to 29 countries, enjoyed life, and lived a very, very stress-free investment life, almost zero debt, in fact. That sort of then segues into, probably the last, sort of 6 or 7 years in the subsequent re-emergence of the property journey. But that's a little bit of what happened. So exciting times, all sort of wiped in sort of 6 months with, pretty heavily overgeared sort of share portfolio, basically.
Okay. Before we sort of go into that, let's talk a little bit about the shares, because I think a lot of people listening to this may not be complete property converts yet. They might still be sort of thinking, okay, we've got metals, we've got crypto, we've got shares. Your experience with shares, when you took out the margin loan, a margin loan essentially is when you're borrowing money to buy shares. And if the shares go up, then that's great. You pay the money back and you take the profit. If they go down, then you need to sell in order to pay back the loan. And there's a limit to how far the shares can go down before the people who've lent you the money have said, no, you have to sell. Because if it goes down any further, you don't have enough to give us back the money that we've lent you. And so the volatility in the share market means, well, if you have a very high appetite for risk, then you're okay, right? Because you might be prepared to lose a whole lot of money if you end up with a margin call like that, right? If you borrow money, you buy the shares, the share price goes down, you lose everything that was in that portfolio. Some people in their 20s, I know what it's like when you're in your 20s, it's like, no, it'll be all right, and I've got time to earn it back. It's worth a flutter, It's not exactly the casino. And of course, when we're in our 20s, we always think that we're cleverer, that, we always think that we've worked it out. But then you can end up getting stung. And so a lot of people look at property, and property doesn't perform as well as the share market necessarily if you're looking at it just in a dollar for dollar return without any borrowing. But once you start borrowing, then, if I have a look at the numbers just for the WA property, the total amount that it cost you to get into that, now this is a few years ago, right? So it would cost a little bit more now, potentially. Although, remember, ANZ, some of the big banks, they're doing 3% deposits, right? You can get your LVR up at 97%. You have to pay lender's mortgage insurance properly, but you might be able to get a refund on that later, or partial refund on that later. But looking at the numbers, it was a shade under 80 grand, right? $79,945. It was the cash required for the purchase in WA in that awesome suburb. And the return on your capital invested as of May 2024, so that's May of this year, 226.4%. So that's tripled your money effectively. Now, that's just going from May. Now, you said it's probably up at about 420. So if it's up at 620. If it's up at 620, then that's a clean 200, which means you're probably looking at about 2.5 times your money. That's the profit. So it's about 3.5 overall. Now, 3.5, that's quite a lot. In fact, that's a huge amount because you still have the original 80 as well. So you think, what kind of risk would you need to take in the share market to get a 50% return in the share market? What kind of risk would you need to take? And yet with property, because you can leverage with such safety and confidence, because the property market always seems to be going up enough so that people don't end up with the equivalent of a margin call coming in, because we don't have big dips in the property market. The banks and the government, they just want to keep on propping the property market up. The last thing they need is a dip. If that happens, the economy is in insane level of trouble. We have so many measures that governments and the banks have put in place to stop that from happening. So you can get this kind of return, right? 226.4%. It's probably closer to 250% return on capital invested. And that is just the profit, which means overall your money has gone from 80 grand to 3.5 times that, which is huge.
Yeah, well, the moral of the story is I haven't ever got another margin loan, but I have been brave enough to go back into shares.
Yeah? How's that going?
And you know what? The learning out of the GFC was when markets are oversold, generally it's a good time to buy, and I jumped back in when COVID hit and had a bit of money I had for a home deposit, and thought I'll sort of dip back into there. But interestingly enough, I was looking at the share performance of that the other day, and I've done sort of around about 50% on that investment. And the answer to your question is you do have to have some mining stocks, not like high-risk mining stocks, but you do have to have your Fortescues and that sort of stuff, which typically over-index, although not at the moment. But the big one is the gearing, with a house, 100, just simple maths, 100 might allow you to buy, 500, 700K property, whereas 100K in a margin loan's probably only going to be another sort of 70 on top of that. So you're going to have some phenomenal returns on the share market and probably be in really high-risk plays to have anywhere near the level of growth that I've had in the Australian property for sure.
Okay.
I don't know what the numbers would be, but
bloody good spot. And how's tell me the story about buying the one up in Queensland as well. You told me you got an interesting story around that one.
Yeah, I originally we got a place in Rockhampton, and it was a sort of bit of a firebrow one, but awesome place, big block, really well bought, like the sort of fundamentals around it. But like anything sort of that era, early 80s, that type of building and pest inspection probably wasn't the best. Could have done it if I was a builder, probably could have done it if I was a good handyman, so not insurmountable, but chose to sort of move on from that and got out of that, very well, I thought. And then the guys bought a fantastic property for me up in Townsville. Needed a bit of a cosmetic reno. Me and a friend of mine flew up this time. I paid him. And he was very handy actually. All the stuff I couldn't do, he could do. And between the two of us, we did a really good job. Because most of the areas which are high growth tend to have trade shortages, so it can be some simple things like even you're only as strong as your weakest link in a reno, and the kitchen doors were the weakest link when it come to the renos. They had a bit of water damage. Only cost about $400 to fix, but it took 5 weeks to get them back, which meant that we had to do showings with no kitchen cupboards on. So it's certainly not the best rental user experience showing the tenants through with doors off. But anyway, the doors are back on now and it's fine. But I just wanted to add a bit of value straight away to that property. I thought that just needed a lick of paint, some new air conditioning. Trees out the front were just sort of a bit overgrown, made the place look a little bit smaller than what it probably could have been. So I thought we could probably lift the value, both, in terms of dollar value, but also the rental yield or the amount we can rent it for. So I put extra on rent. I haven't had it valued, but probably had a quick look, and I think probably paid around about $445 for that. Should get around about half for it. Now in whatever that is, sort of 3 or 4 months, probably 15 in on the reno though, in truth. So plus my own time, but it looks good, well presented property, and it should be a very low maintenance. Same suburb as uni, same suburb as the biggest hospital outside the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, and Brizzy, not far from the army base as well. So should always have a tenant and a queue for tenants, and that's been the case.
I want to talk to you because I mentioned earlier how important it is that people have sort of a goal and then they develop the strategy aligned with that goal, bearing in mind, what kind of stress level they want to put themselves under. What's the big goal for Tony Wilkinson?
I want to probably, over the next sort of 3 or 4 years, end up with 4 to 5 properties. I'm already I've got enough in the equity, and particularly the place in Bunbury, to already do that. Just probably want to see how the economy goes between now and the end of the year before sort of launching into the third, just because I've got a couple of different mortgages and working in sales. Things can be a little bit sporadic. So I just want to sort of chart the rest of this year, but then literally get into the next one in 2025, and probably 3 years, end up with a nice balanced portfolio, let them all sort of grow, not have too many of them negatively geared, have them positively geared or just a little bit behind, have sort of some of the positive geared properties that you've had for sort of 3 or 4 years paying off, the shorter term ones, and still, be contributing each month, but certainly not, impacting the lifestyle. So that's probably the next sort of 10-year plan, just letting those accumulate and grow. It's fairly ambitious, but feel as though, well placed to do it, that's for sure.
If I'm going to ask you, because I know you've got a lot of experience dealing with shares, something that, or a way of thinking about shares is, if you have a couple of grand left over, or let's say it's $600, right? Just use a simple number, $600 that you have left over at the end of a month. A lot of people might put that into the share market. And you go, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm investing. So they're investing their $600. Well, do you know that the market's going to go up that much? No, but seems like a sensible thing to do, right? No one questions it, right? I'm putting that extra $600 into the share market. Everyone's like, okay, oh yeah, that's clever. That's good, right? That's smart. When it comes to property, if a property is negatively geared by $600 a month, right? People have a different thinking around it, a different mindset. They're not like, oh, I'm investing that into my property portfolio. It's like, oh yeah, it's costing me, right? Just a different sort of way of thinking about it a little bit. They're not thinking of it as investing in it in the same way that people think of investing in a share portfolio. And if the share portfolio goes up, then sort of like it's easy to see it come back quickly. Whereas property, depending on where people used to buy 10 years ago, we weren't seeing the rapid growth that we see these days. Nowadays, we do see that rapid growth kicking in. Not necessarily on the cash flow side. That takes a little bit longer to get the rental increases in. Certainly the initial growth. So feeding something for $600 a month, if that happens to be a number that something's negatively geared by, and with the confidence that the overall asset is going to grow by, like in your case, $200,000 over the course of 2.5, 3 years, that's a pretty phenomenal return, right? Because that extra $6,000 that it might cost someone, it'd be $7,200, right? If it's $600 a month, $7,200, right? So we're looking at about $21,600 of negative gearing over 3 years, but it makes 10 times that, then it's a pretty good result, you would think, for most people. So there's just a little bit of a mindset switch that sort of pops up, I think, that's really important to sort of talk about, that not enough people talk about it, right? Just with the language, I'm investing in the stock market, my property's costing money. It's like, no. More than likely, investing in the stock market is the thing that's costing me money, and the investment in the property market is what's creating the wealth. That's kind of the way I think about it. And I think it's a useful kind of frame for people to understand, well, yeah, if you want to get a hidden property, there is a chance that you may be a little bit negatively geared in some parts of your portfolio for a specific time period. But generally, if you can hold it for long enough, then things end up getting pretty good. I want to ask you, you've emphasized the importance of data in your decision making as well. So what are the key factors that you've been looking at?
Dashboard that Dashdot got, I found very handy. The big one I've found is that there's an easy way of sort of seeing what development projects are on the horizon, which I think is super important for buying into an area, because if you've got lots of infrastructure going into to an area, like for example, I think Townsville on the horizon has got major dam construction, some rail, some defence infrastructure, some defence, migration moving from Adelaide into Townsville, which will add more people looking for places which boost rent. You've got solar, wind farms, and then that's not even without sort of getting into your nickel mine territory and that sort of stuff, which also is pretty significant for that area. So I found that data super helpful. Certainly when I looked at Australand and the Bunbury area, I mean, both of those two areas, Townsville, a couple 100,000 people, which I didn't realise until I researched it properly, Bunbury, 2 hours south, they almost act, and I hate to bring up New South Wales, but it almost acts like a Newcastle. Both of those two markets is, pretty much the biggest area outside of it, outside of the metro city. So those sort of things are important. I think the other big thing is being able to look at price history for the area over sort of 15, 20, 25 years, which I found difficult to look at using other tools. Rental history, the gap between supply and demand, which generally sort of pushes prices up. Simple things like, which is not always sort of simple, is you got to think about who you're selling it to, because that's where you're going to make your money, how much you buy it for, how much you sell it for, and buying in a sort of owner-occupier biased area, suburb or street helps you do that. So seeing some data around that's super helpful. Simple things like population growth, income. I think the other big thing, particularly when you're buying regional, is making sure that it's got enough diversification in the employment. So both of those two areas, believe it or not, the biggest occupational grouping is actually health. And I thought that's probably a pretty strong sector for...
Health is really, really great. There are a couple of interesting things when it comes to health, and normally we're talking about hospitals, right? And if a new hospital goes into an already very built-up area, it doesn't change things much, right? Because people have already moved there for the lifestyle, jobs, and affordability, right? Which are that's the big triple threat that an area can have. When a big hospital goes into a regional area, then it can have a big influx of people moving into the area, and that can push the prices up. So similarly, you were talking about the infrastructure projects before. Infrastructure is super important, and it does have a very strong effect on property prices, right? It's also really important to have a look at what type of infrastructure project, because there are some infrastructure projects where there's a whole heap of jobs that happen when the project starts and maybe for 6 months after it's up. But then a lot of automation kicks in, right? So you need a whole lot of people to build the thing, but then after that, it can mostly run itself. And then there are other infrastructure projects that are going to require a constant workforce. So it kind of depends on what type of infrastructure project. But I like what you said about the diversity of income as well. That's really, really important. The diversity of industries, right? Because that means that people are going to have incomes coming from different places. They're not sort of dependent on one sort of thing. And then if there's a downturn in that market, then all of the property prices can suddenly be affected, potentially. Also, you mentioned the DSR, or demand supply ratio, and you mentioned the little graphs. That's something that I know our tech guys are super pleased with, and it's really, really useful for trying to determine whether an area is primed for growth. And what we're looking at is the amount of demand that there is in a particular area versus supply. And at Dashdot, we're lucky because we've got a whole tech team, right? We spend about $1 million a year just on continuing to refine and develop the tech that can perform the modeling. And DSR, demand supply ratio, it's a custom metric that we actually created so that we have some data that represent the demand in an area. We have some other data that represents the supply. It's mostly going to be building approvals and things like that, properties on the market, etc. And by crunching the numbers really intelligently, we can actually get a ratio. And then we can work out, okay, well, how does that ratio reflect what's likely to happen in the next 15 months? And using that has been absolutely integral in being able to spot the areas that we have at Dashdot. When we have a look at the numbers that we've been able to achieve, in the suburbs that Dashdot has been investing in, those suburbs have gone up on average by more than 16%. Now, those numbers were from July 1 last year to June 30 of this year. So over that 12-month period, 16 plus percent, right? It was about 16.7% overall. That compares with how regional areas have gone throughout Australia and how the greater capital cities have gone throughout Australia. Regionals were between 9 and 10. The greater capital cities were between 6 and 7. 7.2. But it might be the other way around. But nevertheless, by using things like the demand-supply ratio, right, as a really important metric, looking at infrastructure, looking at diversity of industry, those are the key reasons that we're able to sort of pick these suburbs so long out before everyone else is sort of rushing to them. So I like the way that you've sort of broken it down very analytically as well. You haven't just sort of said, oh, well, that's what the numbers say. You've sort of dug into it and had a real look, which I think, takes a lot of thoughtfulness.
Yeah, well, I think I probably looked for about 2 or 3 years, I reckon, before actually ultimately buying in, Australia. And I just found I got analysis paralysis. I didn't know whether to buy in Sydney, didn't know whether to, friends were creating a fair bit of noise, done very well out of Sydney property. I looked at, Sydney property I bought in the 2000s, and yeah, you're absolutely right. But you've probably got to look at it, at this particular point in time, what's sort of right and wrong. And certainly find that, the place I live in currently would be a 2.5% rental yield on how much the property's worth. So if you actually bought that, it's got to grow in capital growth. And if you're paying sort of 6-7% interest on it, you're obviously losing that amount of money each year in negative gearing. That's the choice, that I made. I thought that regional areas were a lot more affordable than metro areas. I thought sort of technology, I thought a lot of the wealth that was actually sort of being created by Australia generally was being skewed towards regional markets anyway. Lots of trade, lots of sort of health-based positions in those markets, really sort of strong growth over time. I went to a presentation the other day, which a statistician did. I'll come back to you with the name of that guy, called Boomtown, basically, which is all about regional property growth. And there's a millennial shift. It doesn't have to be a huge shift, so I'm not saying every millennial will move there, but there's enough millennials moving to those markets to actually justify price increases in those markets. And typically they're taking, city incomes with them or part thereof, and they're paying much less on rent in those sort of markets, basically. So I found the fundamentals, and I grew up in the country as well, so, I've got a sort of fond appreciation for those sort of markets. Yeah, that's sort of some of the things I've sort of learned along the way.
Well, I was going to say, with all of your experience, you've been in property, you've been in shares, you obviously understand all of the asset classes, you've come back to property, which is, I think, great for you. What would be the biggest lessons across all of that experience that you have? What would be the biggest lesson or takeaway for people who are listening at the moment, to anyone who's just starting or kind of starting again as you did?
I think property is easily the outside coming up with a phenomenal business idea and owning a business. I think is the easiest way to generate wealth for you as a person, and it allows you to borrow more money than you can against other asset classes without doubt. And you do get that sort of capital growth over time. You do get that sort of compounding of growth, which can become pretty significant the longer you hold it. Just know that saving deposit will be the most difficult, and I've had to do it, it took me 4 years. Tip I've got there is put in a managed investment, that's likely to return 8 to sort of 12%. That sort of helps you, and just basically put as much as you can into that rather than having it into an easy access bank account. I think the one I had was about a week I had to turn around if I wanted to get money out. So it wasn't like just, I could go in and just transfer some money if I needed to. I had to have that sort of thought process around it.
That's a handy tip. I'll just add in our usual disclaimer: not financial advice. This is just something Tony didn't have a lot of success with. Exactly.
Sorry, mate.
No, I'm supposed to say that. I need to say that in just about every show. Yeah, not financial advice. We can give general advice. We can give property advice, but we can't give financial advice.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the smart move, right?
Exactly.
Get into a managed fund.
I think the other thing as well, easy to get wrapped up in sort of headlines of how much a market's moved over a sort of 2 or 3 year period. Just be a little bit careful of that and sort of think, is that going to be the case for the next 2 or 3 years? Just making sure that you're not buying it at the top of that market, because otherwise it can be, worth the same in 2 years, 3 years, maybe even sort of 5 years if you're buying the top of the market, and that can be against other asset classes as well.
That's really tricky at the moment because COVID was like a macro unifying factor across the entire Australian market. Just about everywhere has gone up. So if you're looking around now thinking, I want to buy the dip or I want to buy an area that's gone flat, it's not the same as sort of antiquated ideas like the property clock and, this area goes up and then it goes flat. And while that one's flat, that one goes up. And so you're sort of like playing musical chairs with your portfolio all the time. It's like everything basically went up. There may be a few places that didn't. And if they didn't during COVID, you really need to ask yourself why. Like, why did that not go up? Does that mean that it's primed to go up now? Or is there a fundamental reason that means it'll never go up? Similarly, a lot of places that went up during COVID, it's like, yeah, but that was because of COVID. Before COVID, there was a whole lot of heat in that area. And so now we're resuming with that heat. So COVID is sort of like a complicating factor that has made it a lot more difficult to pick when an area is being flat versus when it's rising, how that indicates what might happen next. So that part there is really tricky. But I know the tech team is sort of like, or conventional wisdom says, well, if it's been flat, it's going to pop. And if it's been rising, then it might top out. That's what conventional wisdom used to be. But it doesn't really hold true in the current environment. You need to look at the fundamentals and work out, okay, well, what's actually happening in this area? Okay, it's had this much growth. Wow, that's a lot. But how much more is there still to come? And kind of assessing it on that rather than thinking, oh, well, I missed out on that bit of growth. So, stuff that area. I'll find somewhere else. It's taking a look at it and working out, okay, well, where's that going to be in 5-10 years, right? Don't forget, like Apple lists in the 80s. iPhone comes out in 2007. Buffett didn't get in until like 2011, 2016, something like that. And then it became his best performing stock. So he missed out all of that time. And yet he still gets in at a time that tends to work out really, really well for his portfolio. So a few important points in there. I think you nailed it, where it's like, have a look at performance, but work out what's happening in the area with the data, with the diversification across industries, with the demand-supply ratio, with the infrastructure projects. Like those things are really, really key.
And I think finally, mate, in terms of a tip, if you're sitting there wondering whether to do it, I think it's probably just, as the Nike ad says, just do it. I think it'd probably be some of the most rewarding parts of your life and some of the aspects you're most proudest of. And there's something in, having investment in ultimately the places that we all live and providing for people to rent from us, basically, as landlords.
Yeah, well, put it this way. I know a lot of people who are very happy that they have invested in property over the last 5-10 years. I don't know anyone who regrets it. I don't know anyone who regrets investing in property in the last 5 years. So that's probably a nice sort of warm and fuzzy note to finish everything up with.
Absolutely.
All right.
Really appreciate it, and thanks for everything you guys have done. And also make sure you listen to plenty of podcasts. I certainly did plenty of that. It's great content that everyone comes up with and comes out with, and it's great hearing from other people.
Thanks very much, and thanks for popping on here and sharing your story with everyone. I'm hoping, I imagine, everyone's got a lot of value about hearing sort of the key thing in here was like, it's not too late, get back into property. It turns people's lives around. It can really fix things up.
100%.
All right.
Beautiful.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.